Fantasy anime has always been a gateway into incredible worlds, epic adventures, and unforgettable characters. But within recent years, a new genre has taken over. While Isekai has brought in some amazing stories, it's also changed how we view fantasy anime as a whole, and not always for the better. Today I'm diving into how Isekai has shaped the perception of fantasy anime and what it means for the future of the genre. Let's get started. First, let's break down what is an Isekai, which literally means another world. It's a genre where characters are transported, reincarnated, or reborn into a new fantasy world. It's become a massive trend with countless shows following the same formula. A protagonist gets a second chance in a magical world, gains powers and abilities, and embarks on an adventure. Sounds fun, right? But here's the problem. In many ways, it's starting to overshadow the traditional fantasy anime. The oversaturation of Isekai. Isekai has become so popular that it is flooding the anime industry. Every season, we get a half dozen new Isekai shows, many of which rely on the same tired tropes: overpowered protagonists, video game systems, and harem setups. This oversaturation is making fantasy anime feel repetitive and uninspired. Instead of exploring unique worlds and stories, many characters are just copying the Isekai formula because it sells better, and that's hurting the diversity of the genuine fantasy genre. Now you might be asking yourself how the oversaturation of Isekai actually affects how people view normal fantasy anime like Frieren. You might say it doesn't, but it absolutely does. And this is all due to the audience's expectation. This issue is how Isekai is shaping audiences' expectations. Because Isekai dominates the fantasy genre, many viewers expect all fantasy anime to follow the same template: a self-insert protagonist, RPG mechanics, and a power fantasy. This leaves little room for traditional or nuanced original fantasy stories. Shows that look by design to fit the Isekai mold often get overlooked due to this fact. Even if they're incredibly well made, it's created a cycle where the oversaturation of fantasy Isekai have made it much more difficult to find a diamond in the rough. It's created a cycle where it's very difficult for typical and classical fantasy anime to get attention. They struggle to stand out. The impact on world building and storytelling at whole. One of the biggest casualties of the Isekai boom is world building. Traditional fantasy often spends a lot of time crafting rich, immersive worlds with unique cultures and histories and rules. But in many Isekai shows, the worlds feel like an afterthought, just a backdrop for the protagonist's power fantasy. They spend the entire time aura farming. This lack of depth at whole affects the public view of the fantasy genre at a whole. And when audiences get used to this type of storytelling, they start to expect it from other fantasy anime that aren't even Isekai. The whole reason I made this video was, well, personally, I would have missed Frieren if it wasn't for a spur of the moment decision. Every now and again, I look on the seasonal shelf of anime and decide if I'm going to pick anything up. I almost never do, especially when it looks like a fantasy anime. I'm talking about typical high fantasy anime. Think of Lord of the Rings, elves, dwarves, etc. I had overlooked Frieren a few times at this point, simply by looking at its front cover. But one day, spur of the moment, I took it and I watched it. And it was one of the best anime I've ever watched. I've made an entire video on Frieren and how it helped me through a pretty difficult time in my life. After I'd watched it, I reflected upon why I wasn't going to pick it up. So I went back and I looked at the seasonal shelf and noticed that the themes it followed were very closely aligned with many other shows that season that I didn't particularly care about, or I'd heard were particularly bad. The reputation of Isekai almost stopped me from watching the #1 ranked show of all time. If Isekai can sully, for me, the reputation of Frieren, what else have I missed over the years? So what can we do to fix this? First, we need to support non-Isekai fantasy anime, like Frieren and the upcoming Witch Hat Atelier. These stories have already done a lot to distance fantasy in general away from the Isekai trope. And I encourage you to watch shows like Maiden Abyss and Mushishi, fantasy anime that prove that fantasy anime can be thought-provoking and deeply emotional, while also being less heavy-handed than the typical Isekai. Mushishi, for example, focuses on traditional folklore and creates creatures for causing the events that happen within them. It does this by creating a very unique world of Mushi Creatures that come in all shapes and sizes that are unseen to the human eye, and only a select few can see them. By watching and promoting these kinds of stories, we can show the industry that there is a demand for more than just mindless slop. Secondly, we need to encourage creators to take risks and explore new ideas. You'd have to be living under a rock to understand that media nowadays has become fairly recycled, using IPs and trends that are safe bets, like isekai, to ride a monetary wave. Fantasy is a genre with endless possibilities, and it's time to start exploring them again. Instead of relying on the same tired tropes, creators should focus on building unique worlds, crafting complex characters, and telling stories that resonate with audience and themselves on deeper levels. Finally, just as a tip, you might want to be more close-minded when it comes to your selection of anime you watch. Make sure that the tag isekai isn't in there, and you might surprise yourself with the detail and quality that you're most likely going to come across. I think we should reward creativity and not taking the safe route. I don't want this video to come across as a hit piece to isekai, because everyone's entitled to their opinions and what they like. I have just found it difficult myself to find fantasy anime that isn't isekai. Isekai isn't inherently bad. It has given us, and me personally, some incredible stories and moments, how it has shaped the fantasy genre in the past few years, and during that time what we might have lost in the process. By supporting diverse and original fantasy anime, we can help to ensure the genre continues to thrive. What do you think of the rise of isekai? Do you think it's helping or hurting the fantasy genre of anime at whole? I personally think that isekai is genuinely on its downfall. It ballooned during the pandemic. There is always 2 or 3 isekai every single season. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to subscribe. I genuinely really appreciate it. I know this might be a little bit of departure than my usual video, but I'm interested to see how this more thought out process does on my channel. Thank you for watching.